Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D. On the following slides, you'll see a demonstration video on making a lidded form for a Saggar fire process.
The GSC for ceramics include alternative firing processes. So what we are going to be talking about is Saggar firing. And Saggar firing is a nice alternative that is pretty inexpensive and also has those quick results that we know that our students really like. It is a very organic process. So the project that I do with this is just a pretty simple lidded form. So I have students make a couple of pinch pots that match up at the rim, and then I have them score and slip them together. And so they get sort of this egg or potato shape. And then I have them smooth as they can get it. I get a lot of good results smoothing with a serrated rib tool, which I know seems counterintuitive, but if you take the serrated edge and score the surface in different directions and then go back with the smooth edge, it is pretty amazing how smooth that surface gets. Students do this and they feel like it's magical because of this smooth surface. And we do talk about a smooth surface with Saggar because in my opinion and in my experience, I found that non-textured surfaces are yield better results with a Saggar. Now that's not to say that there won't be some surface variations, and I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a moment. But we aren't applying surface texture using stamping or carving or applique, or at least using it minimally. So I have the students make their conjoined pinch forms and then smooth them as smooth as they can possibly get them. And if the forms, the clay is at this point is short, so it's not quite leather because they are going to push around on these a little bit to get that surface variation that I talked about. But they do need to be stiff enough to hold their form. So I probably would not do this in one sitting. I would likely have the students make their pinch pots and let them sit separately until the next class wrapped up, of course. If you wanted to wrap them up with a piece of paper to absorb some of the moisture in the bag, that might help encourage it to stiffen up a little bit. And then I would have them join them at their rims and smooth them out. Once smooth, but depending on how stiff your clay is, you're going to start making those surface variations. So what I mean by that is, if you look, here's a finished example of a Saggared form. The texture is smooth, however, the student has gone in and made some indentations that sort of break up all of that space. That one was finished with a clear polyurethane spray. This one I believe had a wax applied to it, so it's not as glossy. But again, you see these indentations just to give it some surface variation, but nothing in the way of stamped or other applied textures. So I will typically suggest students start with a little bit of water on their fingertip and then just decide, where you want to make your marks. And it's a very organic process. Now, my clay is pretty plastic. If your student's clay is a little bit stiffer, they may want to put a hole somewhere in the form so that as they are poking around on it, they are not cracking that seam, because at this point mine is completely enclosed. So as I'm pushing on the outside, my clay is stretching, but if it's too stiff to stretch, then it's going to break open at the seam. This project is appropriate for a beginning level ceramics class. The form is not super complex. There's not a lot of planning involved, and I usually tie that in with the idea that when you're doing a Saggar fire, you can't really plan the outcome. You can encourage some results by the materials that you put in your Saggar, but it's largely sort of given up to the kiln gods at a certain point. So this is a good sort of beginner exercise and kind of getting to understand the feel of the clay and the possibilities and limitations of the clay at this stage of dryness. I typically suggest organic design because the firing process is so organic. And then I just have them continue this sort of mark making on clay, if you will. I do suggest, again, that they start by putting a little bit of water on their fingertips, just so that their finger is gliding along that surface a little bit better. However, we don't want to oversaturate the clay because we do want it to be stiffening up a little bit. You also want to caution your students not to press or indent too deeply. They should know how thick their pinch pots are and how, again, the limitations and possibilities of applying the design based on that thickness and on the dryness. So at this point, I might be done. I might consider just leaving the top of my form that original egg shape, and then the bottom half of the form will have my indented design. And the next step would be to cut a lid. Typically, I would suggest letting the clay firm up a bit, but I'm going to go ahead and cut the lid now. You can always go back and smooth it somewhat after the lid is cut, but generally speaking, you want all of your design to be completed prior to cutting the lid. And the reason for that is that any pushing or smoothing even that I'm going to do on this form after I cut the lid could potentially alter the opening, the shape of the opening that's created when I cut the lid. And so then the lid's not going to have a tight fit. And we want to make sure that our lid fits our form. So make sure that before students jump in to cut that lid, that they have done everything to that exterior that they need to. And on second thought, I am going to let mine sit, and then I will cut the lid a bit later. So I've allowed my form to stiffen up a little bit more to the point where I feel like I can safely cut the lid without my lid opening or form opening becoming misshapen through handling it. I've gone ahead and given it a once over just to make sure it's gotten as smooth as I want it to be. And I've also taken a pencil and I've drawn where I want to cut for my lid. Typically, I like using an X-Acto knife because it's going to get a much thinner cut than your fettling knife will, and that's going to give you a tighter fitting lid. However, a fettling knife will work. We're going to do what is called a pumpkin cut. So a pumpkin cut is cutting at an angle like you would the top of a jack-o'-lantern so that the lid will not fall into the form. It creates a little beveled ledge to hold it up. And I always tell students that they should be slicing through the clay, not sawing back and forth. If you're sawing back and forth, then you are creating a rough opening and a rough edge on your lid. So a nice slow slice. Make sure they're not cutting into their own hands or towards their own hand. So I have my hand opposite where the knife is. If the clay has gotten pretty stiff, then you probably want to use a fettling knife because they might have to push too hard to use an X-Acto knife. So here I have cut my lid. So if your students want to take a moment to go back, it should be a fairly smooth opening, but I like to take this edge off the inside. I'm doing this very gently as not to disturb or alter that opening shape. Taking a little bit of water. And I typically dull sharp edges because even after a piece is bisque fired or glazed, those sharp edges have a tendency to chip. It will give a little bit of a less tight opening. However, I would rather the lid show a little bit of a gap than have a chip in it. So if you got a little off of your pencil mark like I did, you may want to go back. Again, I'm doing all of this gently as to not alter or change the shape of the lid or the opening that it sits on. Let those sit separately for just a moment. I went ahead and made a little finial or knob or handle, whatever you want to call it, to put on top of my lid. If the student, I tell them, if you have to pick the form up and turn it upside down to take the lid off, then you may want to put a handle on it. So that's a little extra something that they may want or need to do. Again, this can go to a discussion about functionality. Is a little lidded jar functional? If you can't take the lid off, probably not. So just like with everything else, I will score and slip this on. And once that's on, the form is ready to set aside and dry so it can be bisque fired. However, depending on the wetness of your clay, you want to ensure that this lid isn't getting stuck. So you can see that mine did not easily come up. I did have to turn it upside down and shake it a little bit. So one thing that you can do is you can take a piece of just one ply of toilet paper and place it on the opening and put your lid over it. And then that will create a barrier so that your lid doesn't stick. Oops. And I always remind students not to pick anything up by a handle, whether we're making a lidded form like this or a mug or whatever, until it's been at least bisque fired. And sometimes I even say not until it's been glaze fired. As with all of the parts that we work with when we are making a form, you want to make sure that the handle to your lidded form is unified or visually harmonious. And we gotta find where that lid fits. Easier said than done. About backwards there. Okay. Another thing that you can do is if you have gaps like this, if your clay is still a little soft, especially if you have that piece of toilet paper in there, you can press everything together and close up the gaps. But here you have a lidded form that once bisque fired will be ready for a Saggar fire.